This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jetz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 227 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Sam Hoadley, manager of horticultural research at Mount Cuba Center, all about Ironweed, Vernonia species for the Mid-Atlantic region. The plant profile is on night-blooming Cereus, and we share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on Love Grows from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Sam Hoadley. He is the trial garden manager at Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate you having me back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. So it's been about a year since we talked about the last research report that Mount Cuba put out. So I wanted to ask you first, any big changes or anything else personally or professionally in your life?
Yeah, I mean, the trial garden's always full of changes. Anytime you come to see us, especially after years pass, there's a lot going on. Generally, every year a trial concludes and a new one goes in. Every time you come to the trial garden, something's new. Last year, we put in a mountain mint trial, so that'll be 3 more years of evaluation. We have plans to put in a new grass trial this next spring. So when we open April 1st, you come back to visit the trial garden, there'll be a brand new trial getting ready to go in then. Just always something new and something exciting, something different to see in the trial garden.
Excellent. And I was able to go to the open house last spring and check out some of those trials in person, including the mountain mint one, and I took copious amounts of photos. That was pretty freshly planted, fairly new-ish compared to some of the other trials in the garden.
Yeah, that one would have been only a few months in the ground. It was planted October 2023, so 2024 was its first growing season. We were impressed right away. We haven't collected data yet. This is just kind of the year. Last year was the year for it to get established, but so much pollinator activity. It's just unbelievable. So we'll be very excited to look at that in more detail, and also look at their garden performance. There's a few species in there and cultivars that are not very widely grown. So hopefully we'll be able to share a lot more about their garden suitability as well as their potential to support wildlife and cultivation as well.
Yeah, I definitely noticed tons of pollinators on them. Everything was looking good and can't wait to have the report on those because can't get enough mountain mint, right?
No, absolutely. They're wonderful.
So our topic is Vernonia for the Mid-Atlantic region, more commonly known as Ironweed.
Yeah, this is our brand new evaluation. We just published results end of January, so this is hot off the presses. This was a 4-year evaluation. We planted this in October of 2019. The growing season of 2020, this trial was allowed to get established. We weren't collecting a lot of data. And then we started collecting data both from a pollinator perspective and from a garden perspective in 2021, 22, and 23. And we have just released the results on the top performers from a garden perspective, as well as some of the results from our pollinator observations from that trial.
So let's talk a little bit about Vernonia as a genus. I know it's in the aster family, and a little bit about its preferred growing conditions. I know it's a huge family, and we're specifically talking, though, only about the North American native portion of that population.
Yes, exactly. Their ironweeds are found worldwide. Fun fact, the largest aster family member in the world is an ironweed that's found, I think, in southeastern Asia. It actually comes in a tree form. But Vernonia in North America, and specifically eastern North America, which are the species that we focused on, are herbaceous perennials. They are clump forming. There are some reports of some species being mildly rhizomatous, although we never saw that in the trial garden. But they are herbaceous perennials, and some of them can grow to extremely tall heights. There's one species in there, the aptly named Vernonia gigantea, that reached a height of 15 feet one year, which was, impressive to say the least. There are others that are a little bit smaller, more manageable, maybe for a smaller home garden. They top out at 2 to 3 feet tall, maybe 3 to 4 feet in width. And habitats do vary amongst the species throughout the eastern temperate forest region or the eastern U.S. In the mid-Atlantic region where we are, we're very familiar with New York ironweed, which you typically would see in kind of wet habitats, floodplains, seepages, edges of bogs, that type of thing, even a moist roadside ditch. But there are other species out there, even in the southeastern United States, that like to grow a little bit drier. They're like Vernonia acaulis, Vernonia angustifolia, like to grow in sandy, drier conditions. And some of them tend to be more adaptable than others. But that was really what we wanted to look at in the trial garden, bringing all these various species and cultivars into kind of a common garden setting to see which of these would be adaptable to kind of the average garden conditions we have in the trial garden. But I think the biggest take home from this is, despite various sizes, habitats, there really is an ironweed for just about any home garden, no matter what your conditions are.
That's great to hear, because I'm going to say most of my experience has been with the New York ironweed, which I consider way too tall for my tiny urban corner garden, and that it would just flop over immediately. And also, I have a lot of dry shade, and I don't see that, having a part in there. But my pollinator strip, is on the kind of what I call the hill strip between the sidewalk and the road. And that's pretty dry and hot out there. So
Yep.
I'm not going to be watering it either. So it's good to hear that some of these ironweed we're going to be talking about today might be suitable for that situation.
Yep, a few come to mind. Yeah, and one thing I do want to mention in our trials, they're very low maintenance. After the first year, there's no watering, no extra care. So some of these plants, especially when we were going through periods of drought, they weren't getting any extra water. So the conditions may not be as dry as maybe your health strip might be, but definitely they're not getting the extra layer of care that you might be getting, that some of these plants might actually prefer, especially if they want to grow in more moist areas.
Yeah, and the common name ironweed makes me think tough plant, but I'm thinking that might not be where it got its common name.
Yeah, and that, I will say, the common name seems to be a bit up in the air as far as what iron is really referring to. I've heard it just kind of describing the general hardiness of ironweeds in general. I've heard people referring to the stems just being very tough. They have a very woody feel. And then I've also seen other reports of that name referring to the seeds and the pappus of the seeds. They can have a beautiful kind of rusty color to them. But it could be all of the above. But all of the things are true. They are tough. And those seeds do kind of add another layer of ornamental value later into the fall and winter.
Nice. And the Latin name as well, Vernonia. So Vernon, Mr. Vernon was an English botanist, and he explored the mid-Atlantic region of the U.S.
Yep.
And I see in the notes here, late 17th century.
Yes, and certainly one year in particular, he was very active in the mid-Atlantic, apparently collecting in this area.
In this area, we should tell listeners a little bit about Mount Cuba Center, where you're located, in case they didn't listen to those previous episodes with you, which I will link those also in our show notes so they can catch up on those previous reports. But let them know a little bit about where Mount Cuba is, your soil conditions and growing conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mount Cuba Center, for those of you who haven't visited us before, we are located in northern Delaware, just north of Wilmington and just south of the Pennsylvania border. We're in kind of a hilly part of Delaware, and this used to be the home of the DuPont Copeland family, who moved to this area from Connecticut in the 1930s. Really early on, they recognized their passion in gardening really kind of lay with the wildflowers in the area, and they also recognized an importance of, to preserving open space. So all that kind of contributed to the building of the gardens that we have today, and their eventual desire to welcome the public and guests to their garden, to their home after they were no longer here, which is what Mount Cuba is today. It is the legacy of the Copelands. It is the realization of their desire for their home to be a place where people will be inspired by the beauty and value of native plants, and to hopefully inspire conservation action from our visitors as well. And that's what we do at the trial gardens at Mount Cuba Center. We are hopefully inspiring people by the beauty of the plants we're trialing. We're also hopefully inspiring people by the value of the plants we're trialing. And most often we're interpreting the value of these plants as their ability to support wildlife in a cultivated setting. And in the trial garden, which actually used to be the cut flower garden, we are evaluating plants in either full sun or 60% shade, sometimes both. But with the ironweed, it was only in full sun, in soils that are kind of a clay loam, pH between 6 and 7, fairly well drained, fairly high moisture and nutrient retention. But we're not adding anything to that soil on a regular basis. Those plants are really, once they're planted, they're on their own. And we do consider the conditions in the trial garden to represent pretty similar comparison to what a lot of people have in their home landscapes in this region, in the Mid-Atlantic region.
And Mount Cuba is surrounded by a deer fence, because none of those beautiful trilliums would be there probably if it wasn't.
Yes, and we do have, so the core gardens are surrounded by a deer fence. I think it's about 60 acres that are fenced in. Our natural lands are strategically fenced, but largely unfenced. But I will say with ironweed, they are very deer resistant. And resistant to mammalian browse in general. One of the things that you can notice is driving through parts of southeastern Pennsylvania, you'll see, if you see a cow pasture in a wetter area where there's ironweed, the cows won't touch the ironweed and everything else will be eaten, but it will look like these very strange patches of plants. And often those are ironweeds that are just left alone.
Interesting. Yeah, I do see them sticking up and almost sometimes getting them confused in a lot of the lay gardener or the non-gardener's mind with Joe Pye Weed.
Yes. Yep. Another very tall native group of plants, wonderful garden plants, and hopefully we'll do a trial on the eupatoriums and eutrochiums in the future too.
So similar type of, we're going to call it a purpley red color to the blooms, but instead of with Joe Pye Weed, it kind of looks like a big umbel at the top.
Right.
This is more like tiny little asters, similar to daisy.
Yep. It basically is kind of a loose inflorescence of what's made up of much smaller inflorescences called capitulums, which are basically tiny clusters of individual flowers. But it gives you this kind of loose, airy, cloudy effect to the flowers. And most of them, like you mentioned, they're kind of that pinky purpley color. And although some of them do stray more into the pink end of the spectrum, and very rarely you can find more pink to even white individuals in the wild, although it is quite uncommon.
Yeah, I've heard of some naturally occurring cultivars popping up that are more on the pink side, and that sounded very interesting to me, actually.
Yep. No, there's some interesting diversity out there, and there was one ironweed in our evaluation that does produce white flowers reliably. It's called White Lightning New York Ironweed. It's out there. It's actually a seed-grown cultivar from Gelito, and it's an interesting plant, especially if you have the right conditions. If you're someone who likes to garden with things that are unusual or kind of interesting variations on something that's a little bit more common, that plant could definitely appeal to you.
Mm-hmm. And so you're evaluating the hardiness, whether it's garden worthy, the amount of pollinators, which we'll get into in a minute, or how many insects are visiting it. But you're also looking at disease resistant, because I know it is susceptible to like rust and powdery mildew.
Yes. So I would put this in kind of a similar category, or the ironweeds, I would put them in a category with plants like trials like Phlox or Monarda. There was a very high incidence of powdery mildew in the trial garden with the ironweeds, and also a very high incidence of rust. Which you think about it, that's kind of a perfect disease for ironweed, them getting rusty. But in the trial garden, when disease happens, it tends to be at a pretty unsustainable level. But that can actually be a good thing, because plants that are resistant in the trial garden conditions to those diseases are going to be extremely resistant in a common home garden, where you're not going to have that same threshold of disease presence or that concentration of similar plants around. But we found that disease really was exploiting stressed plants. And most often that stress was kind of originating with a mismatch of the plant with soil conditions. Mm-hmm. So plants that really couldn't adapt well to the average garden soils of the trial garden tended to struggle, and those plants were the ones that tended to get more disease than others. A great example of that is New York Ironweed. Really wants to grow in soils that are more moist, and they want cooler root zones. we would see populations, again, they're all around Mount Cuba Center in our natural lands and beyond. They grow in kind of these wet meadows. There's a lot of moisture pretty readily available to them. And they're beautiful. They have no disease issues. They bloom incredibly. But in the trial garden, there's so much disease on those New York Ironweed just because they don't have that extra moisture that they need. And the disease impacts the overall health of the plant, the ability to flower, and also the ability to attract and benefit pollinators. So it's not necessarily that the New York Ironweeds are bad plants, but in these average garden conditions, it's probably not the right choice unless you're prepared to water it regularly. But if you have moist soils, by all means, New York Ironweed is an incredible plant. It supports a tremendous diversity of wildlife, even in cultivation. But it really is about right plant, right place. And our top performers from the trial really demonstrate the plants that are adapted to kind of that average middle of the road garden soil.
Yeah, I would think of it as kind of a ditch plant in that it wants to be in that lower where water collects area. So great maybe for a rain garden situation where the head is going to be in full sun because it does need full sun to get those blooms, but the feet have to stay moist.
Yeah, think about it like Helenium or another group that would thrive in very similar conditions. They just want that cool, moist root zone. They want their leaves and their tops in the sun. And if you can provide those conditions, it kind of opens up another spectrum of ironweed for you that probably didn't perform as well in the trials, but they can be great garden plants in the right spot.
Mm-hmm. And the reason most people would be wanting to add any type of Vernonia or ironweed to their garden is because it is such a great pollinator plant. So it blooms from midsummer to fall, several weeks, whereas a lot of perennials, you might get a week right out of bloom out of them, but you get a long time bloom out of Vernonia, and it has both nectar and pollen on those florets.
It does. And if you strategically plant several species of ironweed, I tend to think of, there's kind of several categories. You have your earlier bloomers, and the earliest blooming ironweeds for us were Vernonia fasciculata, which actually starts in early July. So if you plant one of those early bloomers, you plant kind of that mid-season bloomer, which, that one of those plants, which might be familiar to us, are plants like New York ironweed that are blooming really through the month of August, maybe into early September. And then you plant a late season bloomer, something like Vernonia gigantea. You have several months covered of ironweed blooms, and you're going to get tons of pollinator activity. But they really are, they're wonderful at bringing in insects, a diversity of insects, as well as some specialists that we observed in the trial garden too.
Yeah, let's get into some of those specialists. So I know longhorn bee is one, and it's the host plant for several other species of moss and beetles.
Yep. Yeah, I would say I think the most exciting bee that we got to observe in this evaluation was Melisodes denticulatus, or the denticulate longhorn bee. They're just such a charismatic group, and we first recognized their presence in 2021 and counted them separately in 2022 and 2023. In all 3 years, we were counting the overall insect activity that was visiting these various species and cultivars of ironweeds. But the Melisodes really kind of presented a unique opportunity to us. We have this specialist bee where the females really rely on the pollen of ironweed to feed their young, to feed that next generation of denticulate longhorn bee. And because it's a specialist, it's so interesting to us to try to determine if it has a favorite. We have 45 different ironweeds in the trial garden. Was there one that could support or attract Melisodes more than the others? We really kind of expected to see a lot more activity on, maybe the locally native species, which would make sense, like New York ironweed, because this is the species of ironweed they would naturally encounter in the wild. But we had a lot of other ironweeds that were hybrids, were maybe native to other parts of the eastern temperate forest region. So the question was, does it matter? Will this specialist bee go to any of the ironweeds, or is it going to have favorites? So we did count them separately in 2 years, and really what we saw is this kind of seasonality of activity from the Melisodes. We really saw them for the first time in the trial garden. They would show up in kind of late July, and they would be present for about a month through August, and into very early September, we would see kind of the last remnants of the Melisodes in the trial garden. But that window of activity was really interesting, that kind of late July through August, because it lined up, again, perfectly with New York ironweed. But as I mentioned before, with New York ironweed, this was a species that struggled in the trial garden, had a lot of disease, didn't flower well. There weren't a lot of pollinators on this plant at all, just because it wasn't producing a lot of flowers. But there were other ironweeds that bloomed during that window of late July through late August that weren't necessarily locally native. One species in particular was Vernonia baldwinii, which is native more towards the central U.S., even into the western United States. I think there are populations that extend just east of the Rocky Mountains. But again, that bloom period was the same as our New York ironweeds, but that species, Vernonia baldwinii, was just better adapted to the average conditions of the trial garden, produced more flowers, attracted more insects, and attracted a ton of melisodes. So again, it was really cool to see that the timing mattered, but there's other ways to support this insect in your home landscape if you don't have those exact conditions that, say, that locally native species of ironweed requires.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jetz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jetz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
Any other specific species that stood out on ironweed to you?
Yeah, so the specialist bee was fascinating, but there was an incredible diversity of pollinators that we observed as well. Particularly towards early fall, we would see a big uptick in butterfly activity. We saw a lot of skippers of several different species. And some of the latest blooming species of ironweeds, like Vernonia gigantea, Vernonia missourica, some of these plants that are blooming from into kind of late September and even into October, we'd actually see a lot of monarch activity. And these are the monarchs that are migrating south on their way to Mexico. They bloomed really well, really in sync for those migrating monarchs. There's a lot being talked about in terms of supporting monarchs with milkweeds, but it's equally important to have these late season pollinator plants for those migrating monarchs on their way south. We also saw a couple of species of caterpillars in the trial garden feeding on the foliage of ironweed, which was really exciting. One of them in particular was the yellow woolly bear caterpillar. They can kind of be white to almost like a caramel color. Kind of, again, very fuzzy caterpillar, kind of like what you'd expect from a woolly bear. The adult moth is kind of a white, medium-sized moth. We also saw in a moth survey in our natural lands, a Vernonia specialist moth called the Vernonia stem borer, which we didn't actually see in the trial garden, but it further demonstrates the value of ironweed to wildlife in natural habitats.
So Vernonia stem borer, that sounds like it might cut off the flowers, or is this just that it hibernates over the winter in the stem?
I am not terribly familiar with its life cycle, but I would imagine that it might bore into the stems, go into the pith, and feed on that. And we actually saw a beetle that behaved in a very similar way, which was the ironweed curculio beetle. It's a kind of weevil that would kind of excavate a trench in the stems of the ironweed, lay eggs, and then the grubs of that beetle would feed on the pith and go down to basically the rootstock of the ironweed, overwinter there, and then hatch out the following year as an adult beetle. While it may sound like these insects are damaging the ironweed a lot, the damage was mostly kind of superficial and really didn't cause too many issues for the plants. And one interesting thing that we actually saw several times was woodpeckers landing on some of the tallest species of ironweeds, species and cultivars, going after some of those beetle larvae in the cores of the stem. So I didn't actually see those beetles as a negative. I actually saw them as kind of maybe a hidden positive for wildlife in cultivation.
Yeah, so no need to spray or eliminate them. Yep, nature will right its course. And now that you've brought up the foliage that some of them are chewing on, let's talk about some of the differences of different Vernonia cultivars and the foliage. I always think of it as kind of like a basil and then a tall stem, but I was surprised to see some of the more thread-like ones, and then the one variety that looked almost to me like mullein, the leaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a huge variety of textures and forms and habits that these various species and cultivars of ironweed express. We kind of categorize them from coarse foliage to kind of medium to very fine foliage. And the coarsest foliage of any of the species of cultivars that we evaluated came from Vernonia acaulis, which is a very obscure species found in the southeastern U.S., typically grows in drier, sandier habitats. But it kind of creates this prostrate clump of basal leaves. They're very broad and almost spoon-shaped. And from those leaves basically emerges an inflorescence that sits on top of that crown of foliage. So a very unique growth habit for ironweeds, something pretty unique in the trials and in nature as well. But yeah, just a really unusual form, habit, texture, all of the above. A lot of our ironweeds that we're probably more familiar with in this part of the world have kind of these, I would call them kind of a medium texture, lance-shaped leaf. Some of them are broader, some of them are a little bit longer. Some of them have more serrations than others, more pubescence than others. And then we have this kind of third category of plants that have these very fine leaves. Some of them are almost thread-like. If you're familiar with plants like Amsonia hebrictii, there's a plant in the ironweed trial called Vernonia lettermanii, or Letterman's ironweed, that when it's just in foliage can easily be mistaken for Vernonia or for Amsonia hebrictii. They both have that beautiful thread-like foliage, incredible texture in the garden, really kind of a 3-season perennial. And one of those plants, Vernonia lettermanii, one of those plants that can do well in a very dry, hot condition like your hell strip, would actually probably prefer that setting in cultivation.
Yeah, I definitely have my eye on that one. And that brings us to the seeds and seed heads. So that's another great attribute of ironweed, is that they have those long-lasting seeds, and they might also support the bird population or others that are seed eaters.
Yeah, absolutely. Leave those stems up. Enjoy the plants for the fall, into the winter, into spring. The seed heads on some of these plants are really, really striking. There's the seeds, the pappus, that kind of airy, fluffy part of the seed structure can have kind of a really white color. It can be kind of a creamy caramel color, all the way to even kind of shades of purple and copper. They're all really, really beautiful. And these seeds themselves, as you mentioned, are eaten by some of our winter birds like sparrows and juncos. I often see them going after the seeds of ironweed in my home garden. So yeah, just they offer another great season of ornamental value plus ecological value in your home landscape.
And they will self-sow a bit. And if you want to collect the seed and do winter sowing or other indoor seed starting with it, it needs about 60 days of stratification.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, 60-day period of cool moist. After that, they will germinate readily. You can accomplish that vernalization or that cool moist period in a refrigerator or just direct sowing outside. Both are equally effective with ironweed. And I will say that they do self-sow, but it's not to a point where I have ever considered it to be problematic. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you have multiple species or various cultivars of ironweed growing together, in your home garden and they bloom at the same time, it's very likely that you will end up getting hybrid ironweed, which is very interesting. And for plant breeders, people who are introducing new cultivars, that's a really great trait for this group to have. But if you're trying to garden with maybe a specific type of ironweed only, kind of keeping that in mind is important if you're trying to grow, say, only New York ironweed or only a single species. Just having that as a consideration that they will hybridize if they're grown in close proximity.
Yeah, I thought that's a great point to make, and that's not just Ironweed that does that. So a lot of us seed collectors and seed savers and seed swappers need to keep that in mind, that the proximity of relatives of that plant, because many of them do easily cross and make new cultivars, and they're naturally occurring, of course, hybrids. But if you're trying to collect just that straight species, then you need to either put a little baggie over it or somehow isolate it.
That's right. Yep.
And we touched on garden care earlier. Basically it just needs the cutback in late winter, early spring to freshen it up for the coming season. But what I found really fascinating in the report you all put out was that you experimented with doing the Chelsea chop, because, a lot of the objection to some, say, New York ironweed to having it in your garden is that it gets so tall and flops over.
Yeah, so the Chelsea chop can be an effective tool to produce an ironweed habit that maybe is a little bit more manageable if you don't have a ton of space. I will say some of the best candidates for the Chelsea chop, which is essentially a cutback of growing stems kind of in late May and early June, which is in time with the Chelsea flower show in the UK, which is where the name Chelsea chop comes from. So if you were to cut back these stems in kind of late May, early June, we did it by about half in the trial garden. What's going to happen is you're going to take away that dominant growth point on those stems, and you're going to have those stems are going to break more buds, and you're going to end up with a more branching and lower growing form of that plant than if you were to just leave it alone for the growing season. We tended to find that the plants that were slightly lower growing and finer in texture actually responded better to that treatment than some of the really tall species like Vernonia gigantea. Vernonia gigantea, it would break those axillary buds and you would get some better branching, but the union of that new growth to the old stem tended to be pretty weak and they would break. But from some of those smaller plants, the finer foliage plants like Vernonia angustifolia, plum peachy, Vernonia lettermanii, you would get these incredible bushy, shrubby plants that were maybe, I would say, a third to potentially a half the size of an uncut plant. And those plants will also have a slightly delayed bloom period, which you can actually use to your advantage. If you have a couple examples of that species and you really, really like those flowers that it produces, if you cut one of them back, you will actually prolong that bloom period if you have one that's been cut and one that's been left as kind of a control, if you will. They might overlap slightly, but you can extend that bloom period for several weeks in some cases.
That's a good point. When we do the Chelsea chop, we are delaying that blooming often could be 2, 4, 6 weeks. So keep that in mind if you're doing it to control height and, flopping or anything else like that you also have that effect. But again, that might actually kind of make up for some climate change earliness and phenology, right?
Possibly, yeah. But I think one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're looking at a specialist insect like Melissodes denticulatus that has such kind of a finite window of activity, by cutting back something like New York ironweed in its habitat, you may actually be delaying that plant enough that it won't be accessible to that specialist bee anymore. So I think even for natural lands managers, where you may maybe mowing a field where there's New York ironweed, I think kind of creating or treating that habitat in kind of a combined approach where maybe you're leaving some of it alone and mowing, a certain portion of it, just so you're not interrupting some of these cycles, even if it's just on a piece of that property.
I think that would be very helpful. So we talked about it's self-sowing or us collecting seeds and sowing them ourselves. But another way to propagate New York ironweed is, of course, digging and division.
Yep.
And it's pretty easy to transplant. I don't think it's that deep rooted, is it?
It's not too terribly difficult. And actually, one of the things that we noticed, we've had to move the ironweed a few times now that the trial is concluded, and they will be reappearing in the trial garden this growing season. So now that the report is out, you can actually see those plants in person. But we found that some of the taller growing ironweeds are a little bit easier to move. Their roots are very thick and very fleshy, but there's not that many of them, and it's not too difficult to dig them out, relatively speaking. We actually found that some of the smaller species were much harder to dig out, like Vernonia lettermanii. And this is that really kind of smaller growing mounding species, that very fine thread-like foliage. It produces a tremendous root system, and it was very challenging to move. I suspect this has something to do with where that plant is found in the wild. It's found in kind of river corridors in the Ozark region of the U.S., and it's growing in habitats that are experiencing periodic flooding. So I think it's pretty important for that species to, have a good grip on the soil below it so it's not swept away during floods. But it is challenging to move and divide. Not impossible. You can definitely do it. And we recommend lifting, dividing, moving these plants in fall to spring.
Okay. So you could do it either in fall or in spring, but not in the heat of summer.
Yes, I would avoid doing it in the heat of summer, but we've had equal luck in fall and spring.
Well, that brings us to some of the highest rated ones in your report. And since you were just talking about Lettermanii, also known as iron butterfly.
Yes. Wonderful plant. And it is fairly commercially available as well. We actually did have the wild type species, Vernonia lettermanii, and the selection called iron butterfly. Iron butterfly is a little bit more compact and more floriferous than the wild type plants are. And iron butterfly actually began its journey into the horticultural world in Alan Armitage's trials at the University of Georgia, who then sent seedlings to Steve Castorani at North Creek Nurseries, who selected iron butterfly and named it. But it's a great plant. Again, a 3-season perennial, has beautiful fine foliage, blooms like crazy in late summer and early fall, a ton of pollinator activity. One thing that we did see with it is that in richer soils, even in soils that are kind of that medium average that the trial garden has, the stems of that plant can splay open a little bit and will kind of give you this open center. So that's a trait that can be easily fixed, however, with either, doing the Chelsea chop on that plant, getting it to be a little bit more compact, or by simply growing Vernonia lettermanii in drier, leaner soils. You'll get a more compact plant that will be very resistant to flopping.
Well, I just put a giant star next to that one.
Yeah.
I'm definitely getting that one for mine. But that wasn't the highest rated one. The highest rated in your report is Plum Peachy and Angustifolia Vernonia.
Yeah, which was a really interesting plant that ended up being the top performer. And the reason I say interesting is that we grew a couple other forms of Vernonia angustifolia in the trial garden. And this is a species that's native to the southeastern U.S. and typically grows like Vernonia acaulis in drier, sandier habitats that do benefit from very well-drained soils, especially in this part of the country. We actually had a very high failure rate from that species in the trial garden. We plant 5 of each of these different ironweeds in the trial garden, and we had 4 different versions of Vernonia angustifolia, including Plum Peachy. Only one of the non-Plum Peachy Vernonia angustifolias survived the duration of the trial, but every single one of the Plum Peachies survived and looked fantastic by the end of the 4 years. So this plant just is more adaptable to the average garden conditions in the trial garden, where if you want to grow a Vernonia angustifolia in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's possible, but selecting the right soil type for especially trying to cater to that need for that really well-drained soil and keeping it from being too wet in the winter is going to be really critical to that plant's long-term survival. At Plum Peachy, this was a selection found in Georgia by Plant Delight's Nursery. It kind of creates this lower mounding forming plant, gets to maybe 4 to 5 feet tall, similar in width. Beautiful fine textured foliage, not as fine as Vernonia lettermanii, but the stems and the petioles of the leaves, they have this kind of really pretty blush of purple and red, followed by an incredible floral display. And the fruit and the pappus on the seeds themselves has that same kind of wine-colored blush that is absolutely spectacular into the fall and winter.
And so the next top performer is Vernonia gigantea, and that is local ecotypes.
So those were actually, there are some local populations of Vernonia gigantea, but we were able to collect from a few populations in Alabama. And those plants were wonderful. They're just the species, wild type plant from a more southern population. And we found that those plants bloomed very late and were some of the favorite stops for our migrating monarchs. We actually do a bit of monarch monitoring and tagging here at Mount Cuba Center. And we learned very quickly that instead of running around the gardens looking for the monarchs, we would just wait at Vernonia gigantea and they would show up for us. It's an incredible plant, very adaptable to kind of the average garden conditions, had no disease issues despite its height. It never really flopped over. And it just gives you some really great late season colors. Again, on a very tall plant, so maybe not the most accessible ironweed for people who don't have a lot of space, but if you have the room, it's absolutely worth trying.
Yeah, and the next one, I just love the name, Vernonia Summer's Swan Song.
Yeah, the Summer series, or the Summer Swan Song, Summer Surrender, and Summer's End, these are all products of some breeding work that was done by Jim Alt at Chicago Botanic Gardens. And they're wonderful plants. They all kind of share a similar habit. They do have differences between them, but they're all kind of that lower growing, more mounding form, finer texture, and kind of late summer into fall blooms. Vernonia Summer Swan Song, actually, one of the parents of that hybrid is Vernonia angustifolia plumpeachy. So again, our top performer lending its genetics to another top performer in the trials. But we found that these hybrids were wonderful for a lot of reasons, but they really do give gardeners who don't have a lot of room more options. So if you want an ironweed, but you just don't have the space for some of these larger species and selections, some of these hybrids, like Summer Swan Song, Summer Surrender, Summer's End, some of these selections like Iron Butterfly, Plum Peachy, they do give you some options for plants that could work for you.
Mm-hmm. And next in your ratings comes the Missouri Ironweed.
Yeah, beautiful plant. It's a wonderful species. And again, when I'm talking about all these species, I can find great qualities in all of them, even our non-top performers. But it just really, the ones we are highlighting are the ones that perform well in kind of this average garden conditions that we have in the trial garden, this kind of middle-of-the-road soils. And Vernonia missourica proved to be very adaptable to it. It has a beautiful kind of like almost velvety texture to the stems and the leaves. This form from Arkansas blooms very late. It was another favorite of the migrating monarchs. And it's just an adaptable plant. I suspect that this species can take drier soils and wetter soils. It's just an all-around kind of great performer, but it is a taller plant. So again, keeping that in mind when you're selecting a place to plant it.
Mm-hmm. So you talked earlier about the Baldwinii, the Western Ironweed, and that super tall one, Jonesboro Giant, which is 12 to 15 feet. So those are a couple that probably not so good for the home gardener. But especially Jonesboro Giant, that 12 to 15 feet, I'm even just trying to picture where.
Oh my gosh.
It
was, I mean, talk about a conversation starter. People from, I would say, every layer of experience, from someone who's a beginner gardener to people who maybe have seen it all and are experts. Everyone who saw this plant was stopped in their tracks. Just like, I don't know of a perennial that's bigger. It was absolutely incredible. And yet, I think the record height that we measured from it was about 15 and a half feet tall. And that was in a wetter year in 2022. Again, despite that size, it was very sturdy. The stems were huge. It's a truly impressive plant. And I have it growing at home in kind of a very deep border where you can appreciate its size from a distance and it's not right up next to a path. But it's a very, very cool plant. Again, where space allows, it's worth including in your garden.
Mm-hmm. Definitely something to brag about.
For sure. For sure.
So any other advice on ironweed for our listeners?
Yeah, I would say experiment a little bit on your own. If you have different conditions, if you have, wet soils, that kind of opens up a whole another group of plants that are possible for you. Or for like you, Kathy, if you have drier soils or some of these tougher garden conditions, there are ironweeds that I think could be really, really well suited to your conditions and may actually prefer your conditions. So yeah, if your trial conditions, if you're listening to the description of the soils in the trial gardens, and you don't have those conditions, don't despair. There are ironweeds that will work for you. It's worth trying. There are even some ironweeds that can take a little bit of shade, like Vernonia glauca. It's another species that's native to the Mid-Atlantic region into the southeastern U.S. It's a little less common in the wild and in cultivation, but it can take a little bit of shade. It can take drier soils. It's worth trying in those situations. It's definitely worth playing with a bit, but I just have found endless enjoyment in the ironweeds that I've planted in my home garden. They've rewarded me year after year with beauty, with a tremendous amount of pollinators visiting these plants. I've seen melisodes visiting my ironweeds at home. It's just a great group of plants that I think is gaining popularity, and hopefully Mount Cuba we're able to shine a very deserving light on this maybe underappreciated group of native plants.
Mm-hmm. And as Sam notes, the ones that are being introduced by or sold by Plants Delight nurseries and others, once this report comes out, Sam, and hits the streets, which it just has,
Yes.
they tend to get ordered up.
Yes.
and sold out. So don't undersell your influence, Sam, and Mount Cuba's influence, because I think as soon as these reports come out, people are like, I need that plant in my garden. So I know that I'm going to have a tough time probably finding iron butterfly this springtime, but I will keep it on my list. So if you don't find it at your first source, just keep searching around, ask local gardeners, check your native plant sales locally. And what other sources would you recommend?
Yeah, native plant societies, check your spring plant sales, check online for specialty growers. Some of these will be a little tougher to find in the near future, but it's something we're taking a much more active role in, trying to promote the accessibility of these plants and the production of these plants ahead of time, especially if we're observing a trial, and even if it's only a year or two in, if we see a plant that we're really like, oh my gosh, this is an incredible plant, but it's not very widely grown, or if maybe only a few people are growing it, we're trying to be a little bit more proactive in our communication to the nursery industry to say like, hey, this is one we should be paying attention to, and maybe build up stock, and this will be one we promote, and hopefully there'll be some demand associated with that. Just being a little more strategic and preemptive with having supply to match potential demand once the report comes out.
Good to know.
But yeah, keep an eye out for ironweeds, and growing plants from seed, as Kathy mentioned, it's very doable. There are seed catalogs that sell seeds of the species that are very accessible, and it's a lot of fun to grow them. You can see the variation in your mini population that you'll end up growing in your garden. There's a lot of ways to incorporate them and source them, and hopefully some of these more obscure plants from the evaluation will become more available in the future.
And we should let listeners know how to access the report. We'll, of course, have the link in our show notes, and then also how they can contact you to find out more.
Yeah, so the reports, including the research report that we just published, as well as information on every single plant that went through this trial, the good, the bad, including why those plants that didn't perform well, where they could be utilized to maybe better results. All of that's available on our website for free. It's at mtcubacenter.org. Do check it out. And we also have, for our most recent trials, we've been including some downloadable Excel spreadsheets that you can basically sort and create ironweed lists for yourself. So if you're looking for taller plants, you can sort by size. Shorter plants, same story. If you have drier soils, you can sort by soil conditions. You can kind of use that as a tool to generate lists of plants that will work well for your goals or your garden conditions. And to engage with us, info@mtcubacenter.org. We'd love to hear from you. Send us your questions. And happy to also chat with anyone about future trials. There's a lot coming down the pipeline for future evaluations. As I mentioned, grasses are going to be brand new this spring. And come see us. We're open from April 1st all the way through about Thanksgiving. There's a lot more information about how to engage with us, both in the open season and when we're closed during the winter, on our website as well. There's a lot of cool opportunities to engage with us, especially through education, through talks, that kind of stuff. So check it out.
Excellent. And I was going to note that the gardens are open starting in April, but not every day. I think are closed on Mondays. So don't try to go on a Monday.
That's right. Yeah. So we'll have some extended opening. We'll be open for an additional day this spring. It'll be from Tuesdays through Sundays. And then I think through June, those will be the hours. And then July through November, we'll be closed Mondays and Tuesdays, but open Wednesday through Sunday.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for sharing the research and some of the tips and tricks behind the report and things you learned. And we look so forward to visiting Mount Cuba Center again this spring and summer to check out those trials in person and talking to you about the next report.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Kathy. It's been a pleasure.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jetz and Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Night blooming Cereus, plant profile. Night blooming Cereus are several different kinds of cactus plants that bloom for one night only. They are the dream girls of the plant world. Most night blooming Cereus have white or pale colored flowers and are usually fragrant. Some will also produce fruits, such as the dragon fruit cactus. Night blooming Cereus are grown as houseplants as they are native to the tropics and need temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You can put them outside for the summer, but be sure to bring them back in before it gets too cold. The queen of the night, Epiphyllum oxypetalum, is the most commonly known kind of night blooming Cereus. The flowers bloom between 10 p.m. and midnight. Those who want to invite friends over for an evening flower watch party can plan the event 7 days after the bud starts pointing upwards. To grow night blooming Cereus, give them plenty of light along with a little cactus fertilizer. They need more water than typical cactus, so be sure their soils do not dry out entirely. It's okay if they're somewhat root-bound, meaning the roots are a bit crowded in the container, as that will encourage them to bloom. Note that they can grow up to 10 feet tall, so place them where they can get to their full size and plan to add stakes and ties to support them. This is the classic pass-along plant. You can share your night blooming Cereus with others by taking a 6-inch stem cutting in the springtime. Night blooming Cereus, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, my heathers are blooming next to my back doorstop, and I'm finally seeing the emerging snowdrops. In the garden tips that we shared this week on social media, it was a bit of a potpourri of different advice. We advised that if you have the room and can safely do so, to let dead trees stay up as a snag for wildlife resources. When growing microgreens indoors, you want to plant the seeds thickly enough that you get a good crop, but not so close as to reduce the air circulation between plants. And also, this is the time to cut back your epimediums, take out those old stems and worn leaves. You can shear them back without removing the newly emerging flower buds that will be coming back in the next month or two. So, our shop.kathygents.com website has added many houseplants this week, so I urge you to give it a visit. And again, that's shop.kathygents.com, and treat yourself or a loved one in your life to a new plant. In local gardening events that you might want to attend, I'm going to be speaking at the Philadelphia Flower Show on Sunday, March 9th, and love for you to join me there. So check that out online when you're making your flower show plans. The Potomac Rose Society is hosting an online talk about rose rosette disease that is on Sunday, February 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be the latest research efforts to control the disease being presented by Dr. John Hammond with the Agricultural Research Service. You can register for that for free online at potomacriose.org. Space is limited, so I urge you to do so soon. And the Tacoma Horticultural Club in Tacoma Park, Maryland, is hosting a talk on native orchids in and out of the garden, and that is on Wednesday, February 19th at 7:30 p.m. The speaker is Carol Allen, who is our Insect Index columnist for Washington Gardener magazine and a past guest of this podcast. The meeting is free and open to all, and you can bring a gardening friend. Find out more about that at tacomahort.org. And then finally on February 24th, that is a Monday, at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland, the Silver Spring Garden Club is featuring a talk on new and exciting houseplants. The speaker is Heather Wheatley, another past guest on this podcast, and she'll be presenting the latest new houseplants available to consumers and how to make them thrive. This meeting is in person at 7:30 p.m. and again, it is free and open to all. You can find out more about that at silverspringgardenclub.com. Happy gardening!
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Green Prints. Today I'm reading Love Grows, A Gardener's Romance by Ellen Simone. Valentine's Day buzzed through the high school halls like a whirlwind of anticipation, but for me, it wasn't about expecting grand gestures from my husband John. As the girls chatted excitedly about what gifts they hoped to receive, I found myself explaining, yet again, that I didn't need extravagant displays of romance. Their shock was palpable. "Not even flowers?" they gasped, incredulous. They couldn't fathom a love without flourish. John, my partner in all things, had nurtured my passion for gardening from the very beginning. Unlike his early days of farming for necessity, my love of plants blossomed from childhood memories of tending to small plots amidst the chaos of a bustling family. My uncle, a farmer, introduced me to the magic of growing things, and I was hooked. When John and I started our life together in Maine, we began our own gardening journey. Our disagreements were as much a part of our love story as our shared passions. While John once doubted the necessity of weeding, I tirelessly tended to our garden beds. Yet, even in those moments of discord, his support never wavered. He may not have initially understood the allure of flowers, but he came to realize that they fed not just the body, but the soul. John's gesture of love were rooted in simplicity. A hand-picked bouquet of pansies and Johnny jump-ups spoke volumes, his understanding of my heart evident in every bloom. But it was his grandest gesture that captured the essence of our love. Inspired by a winter adventure in Quebec, he transformed our backyard into a skating wonderland, complete with ponds, benches, and twinkling lights. And amidst it all, he created a heart-shaped pond, a symbol of his love that echoed through the frozen landscape. As I glide across the ice, under the canopy of stars, I reflect on the girls who yearn for fleeting gifts. For me, love is not measured in wilted flowers or sugary treats, but in the enduring moments crafted by hands that hold my heart. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.